I'm the chair of Adaptive Track and Field USA. We're putting together these webinars. This is the first in a series. Tonight's webinar will be on seated throws. Our April webinar, which will be on April 6th, will be on VI, the visually impaired. So, and then we'll follow up in May, probably with a session on the course for those that haven't taken it yet and would like a primer of going through it online. So that's where we are. And then we're going to follow those up with the USATF Para Level 1 certification course is online, and we've got over 150 people that have taken the course and the test. And the webinars that we're going to have post-May will go around those questions that were missed the most and those that we think that we need a little refresher on and some more information around. So that's the way we're going to go. If you're missed the course tonight, then we are going to post it up on the Adaptive Track and Field USA website, atfusa.org. And we will also, Jessica will also put it up on Move United's site. So it'll be available for those that have not seen it through those channels. Tonight we have seated throws, and to deliver the presentation, we have two international technical officials from World Para Athletics, Jerry Clayton, who lives in Colorado, and Dave Weicker, who is our Canadian ITO, one of the Canadian ITOs. Together, they put together a couple of these, this one and the VI one, that they gave to the Canadian officials group, and now we're doing it here. And they've also delivered it to the Brazilian officials. So it's getting a lot of play, and we think it's worthwhile. We took, if you've taken the course and the test, the videos on seated throws that are in the course come out of this webinar. So we'll be going through those in a little bit more detail, and hopefully you'll be able to see and hear better from our two presenters exactly the rules around and why those are fouls or fair throws. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dave Weicker, who's going to take it from here.
Yep. Thank you very much, Phil. And just so those who are geographically challenged, I live on Vancouver Island and on the east side of Vancouver Island. So I'm close to Vancouver, but far enough away that it takes 13 minutes by plane, but I have to drive an hour to get to the airport, or it takes 2.5 hours by ferry to get to Vancouver. So, Jerry, can you share the screen?
I sure can.
Follow up with Larry ASAP. I won't repeat what I've just said. The toll-free number.
Just as a reminder, everyone, if you could please go on mute so that we only hear our presenters, that would be great. Thank you.
You should have a full screen of the slide, number one.
Yes, I do now. I do now. Thank you, Jerry.
Sure.
And so this is, as the slide shows, it's all about seated throws and the adaptions for parasport to allow competition for those that cannot ambulate or those who have to throw from a seated position. Next one, Jerry. And so who we are is Jerry Clayton, who is an ITO, technical delegate and educator for World Para Athletics. That's WPA. That's probably one of the few acronyms that we're going to use. ITO is one, WPA is one, USA is one. And they all seem to be on this one screen. And I am an ITO from Canada, technical delegate and educator for World Para Athletics, and I'm from Canada. I'm also on the photo finish panel. for both World Para Athletics as well as for World Athletics. So I get a little bit of play here and there. So Jerry's going to show us a little video here on seated throws, and then we're going to ask a question. And Jack and Carol, you're not allowed to answer this question yet.
Let me run it one more time.
And there's no sound, so don't worry about that. So the question is there anything wrong with this? And by the end of this session, you'll know the answer. And as an idea, just a hint, there are two things wrong that we'll talk about. ITO is International Technical Official, Jeff. And if you want to know how to become one, you may want to talk to Jerry after. It's not easy. It basically means a lot of activity. And so I don't know how long Jerry's been within the sport, but I've been in the sport of athletics for over 40 years. And one of the first events I ever did was for visually impaired, and they were blind athletes. And that was when they had what were known at that time as collars, and there would be two collars. One would be at 50 meters and one would be just past the finish line, and they would be essentially calling left, 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 or right, right, right if they were moving out of the lane, and then they moved back in the lane based on what was being called. So what we have for educational goals for this session are: which athletes participate in para-athletics? What equipment do they use? What events do they compete in? What are some of the general conditions? Some of the setup and timing of events, judging the events. For example, how do you judge lifting? What assistance they're allowed, and any unique adaptations for some classes of athletes. And I noticed we have a couple of athletes who are registered for this course, so that's great. But we also have a lot of high school officials, NCAA officials, as well as USA track and field officials. And so we hope that you will continue your work within the World Para Athletics umbrella. So for this event, the rules that are of significance are Rule 7 relating to assistance, Rule 34, which are general conditions for all seated throws, Rule 35 are seated throw requirements. So that's essentially the equipment piece. Rule 36, seated throws technique, lifting and failure. And then also we have Rule 37, which is unique to club throw. And then in addition, in the rule book, there is a World Para Athletics implement weights for different sport classes. And we have someone on the line who's probably going to be the brunt of one of my comments when I talk about some of the implements at some point. So what are the, why do some of the athletes have to throw in a seated position? Well, it's essentially because many, but not all athletes have difficulty stabilizing and supporting themselves for the purpose of throwing while standing. And as a result, they have to throw from a seated position. And there can be very different reasons for this. The second reason why we allow some athletes to sit to throw is that there's a variation in functional limitation resulting in unfair competition. Therefore, IPC, and IPC is the International Paralympic Committee, and World Para Athletics have changed the rules so that no one could gain an advantage using their legs to enhance their throws. Everyone who fits into this category of seated throwing must now remain seated and cannot rise above the seat until the implement has landed. But we'll talk a little bit about that later. So in terms of classifications, you can see the highlighted ones, F31, 32, F33, 34 are all in the cerebral palsy category. And then F51 to F57, they tend to be in the spinal cord injury. But there are also a few others, F35, for instance, have the opportunity to throw with F34 athletes, and F44, 61, 62, 63, and 64 have the opportunity to throw in a seated position as well. So they can, those are all amputees, and amputees can throw ambulant if they feel confident, but if they don't feel confident, they can throw in a seated position. And the F44 and 61 to 64 would throw in the F57 category generally.
Yeah, it's the point there is they move from a very high end of their ambulatory, low end of the ambulatory class, and then you get placed into the very high end of the seated class, mainly because they have trunk.
Right. Now, we also have, the next slide talks about some of the implements. So the implements used, there's quite a range. For example, in shot put from 1 kilogram to 7.26 kilograms. For the discus, it's 750 grams to 2 kilograms. Javelin from 400 grams to 800 grams. And club is essentially one size fits all. And the ones that are asterisked are implements that are licensed by World Para Athletics specifically, as opposed to the other implements which are available and licensed, or not so much licensed as they are certified by World Athletics. And each athlete is the other way, Jerry.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Each athlete is assigned an implement size and weight based upon their class, based on their level of functional limitation in the sport, as well as age and gender. And this is where, well, actually it's the next slide that has a cautionary note, that you will see that in shot put male, for F33, it's a 3 kilogram shot, and for F34, it's a 4 kilogram shot. And you have to be very cautious because they can be the same color and in fact the same dimensions, but they would be a different weight. And you have to be careful of the different weights, right, Josiah? We had in Desert Challenge one year, we had an athlete from Mexico throw a world record in shot put. And when I took the implement to be weighed, found out that it was the wrong weight implement. It was the right color, but it was just inadvertently given to the athlete as the wrong weight. And the athlete's not going to complain because it's a better implement to throw.
I should offer one clarification. It was a regional. I do remember that it was a regional record qualifying performance that is equivalent to Pan American. It was not. It was not a world record. But yes, I do remember that one, and I appreciate you reinforcing that. Yes, you do have the unique issue because 3K and the 4K shots are similar similar diameter. I will confess part of the issue was that the appropriate implements were not clearly marked. When I had dealt with implement inspect appropriate meets and various implements being used together, I make sure to write on the shot the appropriate way. But I do appreciate your input about the situation.
Yeah, so as you can see, the second note on the page is when officiating seated throws, you must always verify the athlete's assigned implement with that listed in Appendix 1, especially if there's a mixed class event. So if you have an F34 and an F33 throwing at the same time as a mixed class, then you need to know, and it's usually written on the start sheet or the field sheet, which implement they throw in terms of weight. And in some cases, it may even be a personal implement that they have already brought in for through the technical manager, so they can throw that as a personal implement. So the next piece is field throwing chairs. And the minimum dimensions are the height of the seat cannot be any higher than 75 centimeters, including the cushion, and that is without the athlete sitting on it. And the second piece is that the seat size must be a minimum 30 by 30. It could be square or it could be rectangular. The orientation of the seat must be level or higher, or the front should be higher than the back of the seat. And we usually know what the front of the seat is or the back of the seat because athletes are told, usually through the technical package, to put one of their numbers on the back of the seat. So we know that's the back. And chairs or throwing chairs can have a backrest and side rest padding, but the padding can be no greater than 5 centimeters. Now, remember, that's the padding only. That doesn't include the frame or the metal part that might be part of the padding, if you will. Okay. And the next one is throwing equipment for group measures. Often there is a chair measurement session done prior to competition. And this is a courtesy check, usually by international technical officials. It could be done through call room staff also, but it's done prior to the competition. And this is so that if there's an error in the chair, there may be enough time for the athlete or the athlete's group to repair the chair and make it legal. Now, you must also remember that the throwing equipment is checked in the call room anyway. So as I say, this is a courtesy pre-check to allow athletes to make changes to their throwing chairs if they need to. Now, next one, Jerry. Throwing chairs may also have a vertical pole, which is allowed for the purposes of facilitating balance during the throw for all users, but it's not to be used for performance purposes and therefore must be within 5 degrees of vertical and a single piece of straight an angled, a straight piece that is straight. There are in some cases, and you'll see in the next image, it will be, there could be a brace attached to the pole, which will secure it more. And also, if as a technical official, if you're seeing that the pole is varying too much from center, you can ask the athlete to hold it lower down, because the lower they hold the pole, the less it will flex. Now, you'll also note that some tape is allowed on the pole to facilitate the grip, and in some classes, they can tie their hand to the pole and tape it to the pole so that it gives them a little bit more support. And these are athletes that do not have the hand function that many other athletes might have. So the next is an image of you can see the vertical pole on the left, and you can see the support on the right, the support structure, which allows the athlete to ensure that their frame or their throwing vertical pole doesn't flex too much when they're using it. Now, the equipment in the field throwing, we've talked a little bit about, you can have tape on the bar, vertical bar, and you can see on the image on the left, you can see there's a lot of tape, and that is acceptable. And you can see on the right, the image where the athlete, who happens to be an American athlete, has his hand securely taped to the vertical bar so that he doesn't fall over, which could create a more difficult situation for both the athlete injuring himself, or for officials who might, or an assistant who might have to try and get the athlete up from the ground. So the additional tape on the holding bar is allowable for F31 to 33 and F51 to 53 athletes to help them with or without a glove. It may be tied to the holding bar. Okay. Now you will see there's an illustration on the left of what is the range at which the pole can flex. And you can also see, you will see from time to time, and I think there's another image coming up that shows how you might want to set up your officiating to watch for the holding bar flexing too much. So it must be a single straight piece and mounted vertically, and it may not flex more than 5 degrees plus or minus. And you'll see the strap, you can see images of the straps that are holding the athlete in place as well. And you can see one on the woman on the left, you can see one holding her around her waist, securing her fairly evenly to the seat of the throwing frame. You will also see that her throwing frame has a backrest as well as side cushioning. And in this case, both of those were measured and they look okay to me, probably to Jerry as well.
Yep.
Now the next image is a little bit trickier because, Jerry, if you can flip to the next slide.
Oh, sure.
You can see that there's additional cushioning in this surface, and you need to measure to the height of the additional cushioning, not just the seat surface itself. And this is probably for an athlete who maybe has a stump and he needs to secure the stump below the, but he needs to also have it in a comfortable position for throwing. Now you'll also notice there's a hole in the middle of the seat, which is used for straps, and that's completely acceptable, as would there may be holes in the corners of the chair or the seat surface, so a pole can go right up from the bottom. So that's also acceptable. Okay, and so this is when throwing. You can see behind the athlete where the pole is, you can see a vertical surface, which is part of the fence. Or you can see, so there are a couple of things that you can watch to see if the pole is flexing too much. And you must not be distracted by, that looks like it might be a photographer, or it might be, there might be any number of reasons why you might get distracted. But again, having something behind that's also a vertical surface is good, because then you can observe whether the pole is flexing too much. Okay, and I think there may be a video of this one.
It's
So
running.
the question is there a foul? And the answer is,
I'll run it again.
we're going to show it again. Yep. And if you watch the top of the pole, you can see how far back it goes. And so the athlete has already been asked to hold it lower down, but it's still flexing too much because he's so strong. See, he would normally hold it at the top, in which case the flex would be far greater than it even is.
David, if you watch the bottom of his chair, the chair does flex and move as well, but that vertical bar has got a huge bend in it.
Right, he's a big, strong guy, probably an F33, maybe an F34 or 54 or 53.
I forget.
Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is a little bit about the process. Sorry. I think we have another video here, right, Jerry?
Yes, we do. Right
Okay,
here.
so let's show this video. The pole must not flex or, now on first surface, on first glance, it looks like it might be flexing too much, but if you watch it again, watch the platform itself. The platform itself is elevating, so it would not be considered a foul. He's also a pretty strong guy, but he's so strong that the weights on the platform are not quite holding it in place. So it's not as simple as watching the pole. You have to watch, well, what's creating that? Is it the athlete, or is it something else? And you see a lot of flex in the platform, especially if it's made out of plywood. And that's why we're encouraging people to use metal throwing platforms from now on.
Can I ask a question on that real quick?
Yes, sure.
It's Candace. I don't know. Hey, as an official, if you're seeing that, of course, this is being replayed and replayed and replayed, and you're showing it's not a foul, this, that, or the other. If it gets called a foul, we don't have that replay awesomeness. So if someone, say, challenges that, how would this be handled?
Well,
Would you give them a retro?
Yeah, normally you would have a throws referee, and you would have the throws referee explain to the people who are complaining about it that it's because of the surface. But if you saw someone bringing out more weight and putting it on the front of the platform, or if you moved the weights from the back of the platform to the front, or some of them, then people would get an idea that it's not the bar that's flexing, but the platform itself. But as an official, what you should do if you see it and you think it's the platform itself, you should try and get some more weight out there and not not allow the athlete to throw until you've got more weight.
Okay, all
Okay,
right. Thank you.
you're welcome.
And David,
Jerry,
if I may,
Jerry,
the
Jerry,
athlete, the
Jerry, this
athlete
is
certainly
Phil.
has the right to do an oral protest at that time. If
Yep.
he's been miscalled.
Right, but
Yep.
this is Phil. You could then leave the mark in the ground, right? And then the ref or someone could see the next consecutive throw and make a valid decision with the head pit official that it was or it wasn't a foul, correct?
Yes, you could do that, and it would depend on the level of the competition. So if you've got say a world championship, and I think this was the world championships in London, England in 2017. And in that case, they were using electronic distance measuring equipment. And so they would have a measurement of it anyway. And what I always encourage officials to do is if there's a foul, to still measure it and record it, but record it in pencil, even though it's there may be a foul or an X in the column that shows whether it was a valid throw or not.
Certainly saves you a lot of jury time.
Yes. Yeah, you don't, and because it was world championships, there was a video referee. So that gets to what Candace was talking about, the having the awesomeness of video. And we had an excellent video referee in London that year, right, Jerry?
We certainly did.
Okay. And the next is, this is another throw, I think. I think we're going to see another video. But what's important in this case is that all of the equipment of the throwing frame, foot plates, vertical bar, etc., must be inside the vertical plate of the inner rim of the circle. Body parts may project outside the vertical plane, but the equipment may not. And the way to obviously, the way to check this is with either a plumb bob or a piece of string that is hanging down off the front of the most forward protruding piece of equipment. And if it has a rock or something heavy attached to the string, then you're able to see whether it's inside or outside of the circle. And you can see in that last image, you could see that the athlete was probably asked to hold the bar lower down because it was probably flexing too much as well. Okay. The next is event process, and there are 5 steps in the event process that are worth talking about. The first is the athlete is called up and their throwing chair is put in the circle. The second step is officials or volunteers would secure the field chair to the throwing platform with the guidance from the with guidance from the athlete or the assistant if there is one for the class. And there's no time limit for this. That's an important part. There's no time limit. The third point is an athlete is allowed to position or secure themselves in the chair and take as many warm-up throws as they wish within the time allowed based on the rules, based on their class. Then the athlete would throw 3 or 6 times, 3 times if it happens to be 2 pools and the top 8 go to a final, or 6 times if it's already a final. And they might have 6 consecutive throws with pins put in the grass as opposed to measuring the throws, but it all depends on what's in the technical package. And then the athlete dismounts from their throwing frame and leaves the throwing area. They would not be escorted out until all of the athletes are finished, however. Now, going to the next slide is a little bit more detail on receipt of the field chair and securing it to the throwing platform. So officials, usually volunteers, will orient the field chair or throwing frame and secure it to the platform or directly to the ground. And it all depends on what is available for securing the throwing frame. And they may use help from the athlete's assistant if allowed. So that's F31 to 33, as well as F51 to 54. They are allowed assistance. And sometimes the athlete or the assistant will sit in the throwing frame while it's being secured just to make sure it's okay. The athlete or the assistant, and the best thing to use tends to be chains, but cargo straps are also typically used. But as with virtually everything else, nothing elastic may be used because that just tends to allow the throwing frame to move too much.
David, if I may,
Yes.
just to put a point on it, the classes F31 through 33 and 51 through 54, those athletes are the more functionally impaired of the overall class in the 50s and 30s. That's why they're given an assistant. Doing things like transferring from an everyday chair onto a throwing chair that's 75 centimeters tall is quite difficult if you don't have the musculature or the coordination to be able to perform that task.
Exactly. So in the next slide, it talks a little bit about the equipment used, and you can see on the in the middle of the picture or the middle of the slide, you can see some cargo strapping, but on the right side, you can see some chains. And normally the chains are towards the top or towards the seat on a 45 degree angle going down to someplace. And in this case, they're lag bolts screwed into the concrete. And it may be a platform, or it may be concrete, or it may just be grass. And if it's grass, then you can use metal poles that are at least 2 feet long, and they're usually driven into the grass at an angle. And obviously you have to be careful of whether or not there's a sprinkler system in the lawn that you're using. We have seen things rupture sprinkler systems, and I've seen that in photo finish when you're setting up at a place that you might be unfamiliar with, and you have a camera on the outfield and a camera on the infield, and the camera on the infield is going essentially on a platform that's anchored by chains, and it's anchored on the grass, so it could be a problem if you're not careful. The second part, next slide, Jerry. The second part of the process is the throwing frame is secure and ready for the athlete. So once it is secure, it's offered to the athlete, and the athlete then says, yes, okay, it's fine the way it's set up. And then the athlete has to transfer to the seat of the throwing frame so that they can throw. And this is when the clock starts. When they say they're ready, then the clock starts, and the athlete either sits on the chair by himself or with an assistant if he or she is in one of those functionally impaired categories, like the F31 to 33 or the F51 to 54 category. And the clock starts based on what they're allowed. So it's 4 minutes for the higher functioning category and 5 minutes for the lower functioning categories. And they have as much time as they want within that period of 4 minutes or 5 minutes to secure themselves and to throw, or to have as many throws as they want for practice throws. So the notes here are that if the athlete sits in the chair during the process of securing them, the time begins as soon as the chair is secured to the throwing surface. And the second note is the chief judge should indicate to the timer when to start the clock for this process. So the total time we're going to talk about will be on later slides. And if in doubt, consult the ITO or referee for the event. They can help you out with what is allowable for what category. The next part of the event process is the athlete is secured. So the athlete ties himself or herself down to the chair and takes as many warm-up throws as they're allowed to within the time limits. If an assistant, if warranted, may assist in the process of moving the athlete from his day chair to the throwing frame. Strapping must only be to the frame and must be non-elastic material. And if the athlete cannot reach an inaccessible strap, the volunteer, i.e., so if he drops it, for example, while he's trying to secure himself, you can, as an athlete, or sorry, as an official or volunteer, you can pick it up and hand it back to the athlete. I mean, what we're really trying to do is make sure that they have an opportunity to compete. And next is, you can see the official on the left-hand side of the picture. He's cautioning the assistant to not coach the athlete. And we tend to have a lot of coaches who are assistants as well. And so it's important that they act as assistants and not coaches. So in this case, it's an F33 athlete. So he's allowed to have an assistant to help secure the athlete to the throwing frame or the throwing chair. And you can see also the front of the throwing platform is already up in the air, and that's probably from torquing the strap a little bit too tight.
Good catch.
Yep. Okay. And then the next part of the process, which tends to be number 4, the athlete begins to warm up, and they can, again, they can have as many warm-up throws as they want within their time limit. When there's 15 seconds left in the strap or warm-up time, a flag should be raised to indicate that there's only 15 minutes or 15 seconds left. Now, you'll see the note at the bottom for securing athletes and taking warm-up throws. It's 4 minutes for sport classes F32 to F34 and F54 to F57. And that's because they are a little bit more functional with their impairment. And there's 5 minutes for sport classes F31 and F51 to F53 because they are lower within their available functionality.
David, do they have to do warm-ups?
They don't have to. And in some cases, when the clock starts, if they run out of time, then the time starts for the first throw. And if they miss that, then the time starts for the second throw. But there would be normally enough time left between those 2 throws or what would be the throw. So maybe 15 to 30 seconds before you would start the clock again for the next time. Okay, and in terms of timing, should the athlete not be ready to compete after warm-ups, then as I was just mentioning, the clock starts for the first throw and the athlete continues to prepare themselves for competition. They cannot have any warm-up throws after that if they miss their 4 minutes or 5 minute period. And then each 1 minute throw time that expires without a throw will be considered a foul or a failure and marked on the sheet, the field sheet as such.
Hey, David, let me just make a quick comment. The rules in the United States for juniors, that would be U14 and below, those athletes, if the time runs out, 4 minutes or 5 minutes, and they have not taken a warm up, we allow them to take one warm up if they need it.
Yeah, and that's fine because under the U14 category is not accepted by World Para Athletics. It's essentially unique to the United States. And it's, in my opinion, it's a good idea to have your own rules for that category anyway, because
Right.
it's a developmental category.
Correct. And then, and also for juniors in the United States, and I'm speaking to the officials that may be working local meets, we also allow assistance to all categories, even the 55s to 57s, but we encourage all the coaches. We've been teaching the coaches, it's an ongoing process, to train their athletes to be able to perform without assistance. So when they do get to an international competition, they can compete legally. So it's a learning process, and we're working to make that happen. But those are the two exceptions to the rules for juniors.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good approach, which is to alert the coach who might be helping to, I'm sorry.
This guy work with
I think we're having a bandwidth problem.
Yeah. What I was going to say to Phil and to others is that, especially coaches, it's a good idea as officials to be flexible to the athletes, but also to mention that if they should be going to a world championship or a higher level competition, that they may not be able to have assistance, as an example.
Yep.
And they may, if they're quite young, they might have to throw a weight that they're not accustomed to as well. So so they need to know what category they might be getting into and practice with the weight according to that category or class of athlete. Okay. And the next, this is the last part of the event process for throwing, which is the athlete is allowed to throw, and the athlete will take 6 or 3 throws depending on the process defined in the technical package by the technical delegate or the meet director. And they can throw in succession without measurement, or they can throw 6 throws or 3 throws and have them measured after each throw. In Canada, we tend to measure after each throw, even if we're not using electronic distance measurement equipment. And certainly that poses some problems because sometimes you have to manipulate the tape to make sure you can pull it through the center of the circle or far enough back anyway. And there are a couple of notes here. The athlete must remain seated from the time the implement has been handed to them until the implement has landed. And so they only have 1 minute for that. I see a note about a question. Can those that are on video, just a minute, I'm going to pull that up on chat again. Can those that are on video please turn off your video for now? That will help with fixing the bandwidth problems for some users that some users are experiencing. Thanks, Jesse. There was also a question about, we do some dual pits with one official being the coordinator and timer. And if that person's obviously going to be very busy. There was also a question, do they allow F54 athletes with 52 or 53 hands, but have a trunk to fasten their hands to the pole? Generally, the answer to that is no, but if there is a note from classifiers that give them an exemption, then we allow that. And it could be at a national competition where a national classifier has given them an exemption. But if they don't have an exemption for by an international classifier, then at an international competition, they wouldn't get that opportunity. Is that your assessment as well, Jerry?
Yes, it is. I believe that was Denise's question. It
Yeah.
has happened, and there is a form and there is a process. Internationally, the process has to take place. I would have to look it up, but it's at least 30 days, and it might be as much as 60 days prior to the competition that a request be made to allow them to have assistance
Right.
based on their class, based on differentiated hands and other elements of the classification process.
Right. And just so you know, I've been a technical delegate at a number of competitions, as has Jerry. And at international competitions, when you're a technical delegate and you get a request for assistance, and it might be from a class that's not entitled to have assistance, normally we would deny it unless there's a very good reason. And the very good reason is usually based on what a classifier might say. And we do have access to the information on classification of individuals.
Yeah, a great example would be an individual who normally would not get assistance, say an F55 athlete, but perhaps they got off the airplane and fell and broke their left arm. They're a right arm thrower. Making the transfer from their chair into the field chair would be really difficult and quite painful and probably cause further injury. And as a TD, along with the medical people there to verify that, we'd probably allow it.
Yes, and I would in that instance as well. I mean, the whole objective is to allow athletes to compete. And if they can't compete without some kind of assistance, and they truly do need that kind of assistance, then we would approve it. Okay, and the last slide that you're going to hear from me, sorry, the penultimate slide, there's one more after this. If the event is held in two pools, the time for athletes to secure themselves to the chair in the final 3 rounds will be 2 minutes for F32 to 34 and F54 to 57, and 3 minutes for the lower functioning categories of F31 and F51 to F53. And no warm-up throws are allowed. Now, this is again for international competitions. And if you have a variance for under 14 athletes or masters athletes, then that's your prerogative in the United States and would be our prerogative in Canada should we make that kind of an adjustment.
We haven't been that lucky to have that many athletes in these under national competitions, and even at our national competitions, to have to worry about 2 pools yet. It would be a good problem to have.
Yes, and usually at our national championships, we have trouble scraping together enough for a combined classes throwing event. Yeah. So that makes our events kind of interesting because you might have a lot of different weights for a lot of different seated throwers. Okay, and the last one is simply a summary slide. So just to recap, the athlete is called up, officials or volunteers will secure the throwing chair to the throwing platform with guidance from the athlete and or from their assistant if they have an assistant, and there's no time limit to do this. Then once the chair is secured and presented to the athlete, the clock starts and the athlete is allowed to position and secure him or herself and throw as many warm-ups as they wish to. And again, they don't have to use the whole amount of time. If they happen to secure themselves quite quickly, they don't need to use more time or have more throws, practice throws. They can have as many as they want. And then step number 4 is the athlete throws 3 or 6 times, depending on what the technical manual for the competition says. And then the athlete dismounts and leaves the throwing area, and their throwing frame is taken out of the circle and the next athlete's throwing frame is brought in. It's quite well choreographed at international competitions, but maybe it's a little bit more difficult at the local level or even at the national level. But the national level that I've observed in the United States is getting better and better all the time. Okay. Now I'm going to hand over to Jerry.
Should we take a short pause and see if there were any questions so far?
Sure.
I don't
There
know if any, Phil, are you and Jesse tracking the chat room?
We are, yep. But David's been doing a good job of reading them, so.
You shouldn't be laughing, Phil.
I'm not laughing.
I'm having a good day.
There are a couple of points though that I think I'll make. One is that for our junior competitions or national meets, of which there are probably 23 or 25 of them in the United States, we tend, if you were the head official in the pit, you tend to ask who's sharing chairs, because it's at the national and the international level, obviously everyone has their own chair, but at the local level and the community level, we tend to share chairs a lot. So to make the competitions go better, we tend to move the rotation to accommodate people who are sharing chairs. And we leave those chairs in the ring between athletes. And then we would measure underneath the chair for the athlete and then put the next athlete in the chair. So that's just one exception. And the other good best practice that I've read, and if you do have over 8 competitors, there is some good documentation that would say that it would actually be just as fast or faster to actually grow that session to up to 12 athletes and let them throw all 6 throws at the same time. And that would actually be quicker than, doing 3 for 12 and then bring the last 8 in for the last 3. So those are just a couple of points.
Yeah, exactly right, Phil. And technical delegates are usually quite flexible depending on how many athletes there are, and they generally look at the interests of the athletes and the interests of the competition at the same time. Okay. I noticed there was another question about how do you watch so many things at the same time? And that's where you need, for seated throws, you need to have more than just one official watching. And Jerry's going to take us through some of those things in the next little while. Okay, Jerry?
Cool. Thanks, David, very much. Thanks, Phil. I appreciate it.
Okay.
So,
Hey, Jerry,
yo,
apologies. Just one more question before you move on. Bill
please
asked,
do.
Bill asked, is the 5-degree limit purely visual from officials' experience?
Yes.
If there happens to be video recording, then the video recording can be used as well. But at the present time, the way the video refereeing process works, it's proactive on track and field, on track, and reactive on field. So they're watching, the video referees are watching every running event, but they're only watching field events based on what they're being asked by the chief judge or the referee at the event site. Now that also implies that you only have video refereeing, or that you have video refereeing at the competition. And sometimes you don't, obviously.
As a rule of thumb, when you don't have video refereeing, it's often appropriate to take a look at the diameter of the bar and look to see if that bar deviates more than that diameter forwards or backwards. And that's probably going to be about 5 degrees. Is it entirely accurate? And can we measure it? No, but oftentimes it's not just subtle, it's a big change, and it's easy to pick up.
And
Like
not
David
only
said when he
that,
was talking about it, you line yourself up with some other vertical surface in the background. It's pretty easy to see that deviation.
and often you will hear complaints from other athletes. So if you hear complaints from other athletes, you just simply need to watch a little bit more carefully. That's all.
Yep. True. So we've talked a little bit about assistance already, and we're going to delve into it a little bit more here. But just to briefly remind you that we allow some athletes to have an assistant basically because they have a disability that creates a functional limitation in their ability to perform in a given sport. Primarily, it's physically, because they are incapable of making a transfer from their daily chair, like we've already talked to, into the field chair. But the assistants can do a number of other things to help them, as well as the volunteer. One thing we want to note is that the officials and the volunteers working the event should not transfer the athlete onto the throwing chair unless it looks like there's going to be an imminent accident occurring, and certainly reach in and try and prevent somebody from being hurt if you're capable of doing that. One of the things that we see occasionally is that an assistant will be allowed. And when the athlete comes out to the event, maybe the gentleman or woman is weighing up close to 200 pounds, huge, strong individual, likely to throw really hard. And they have this petite, young individual serving in as assistant, and to ask them to be capable of transferring that athlete is probably not right, and would probably lead to some sort of injury on that part. So it's something we talk to the call room people about and try and catch that in advance when you see who the assistant is, because at a bigger competition, they will have vests that allow them to come out and participate. If it's a big strapping coach, it's not a big deal, but something to keep an eye out for. Safety is at the top of our list of things to watch out for, after all. David mentioned before, other classes that are less functionally limited, such as an F55 is not allowed to have an assistant, whereas an F54 would be. If such an individual does have a medical issue that makes it difficult for them to, say, transfer from their chair onto the field chair, they would need to go see the official medical personnel for that event, not a coach, not a doctor from their country or from their team. And that medical personnel would evaluate them, and then that would go to the TD, and he would sign off on that or not. If the medical personnel say it's legitimate, then the TD is obviously going to sign off on it. Assistants can help transfer. They can help guide the positioning of the chair. So when your team is going in with a field chair, the athlete has just arrived, you get information from the athlete. You can also get information from the assistant, because they've worked with that athlete. They can help you orient that. And if nothing else, it speeds up the process. Also, the assistant may be allowed to provide fluids to the athlete. The athlete may turn around and say water, and the assistant can bring up the water bottle to the athlete. But at all times, when the assistant is near the athlete during these processes, they cannot coach. So you're saying, okay, I'm an English only speaking individual, and the coach and the athlete are talking in Arabic. Yes, it's a problem. It is difficult, but you can kind of get a hint. And typically all you have to do is kind of use sign language and warn the athlete, because you know they're talking to them and they're talking a lot more about then how much water do you want. But that's kind of the approach we take for trying to prevent assistants from coaching. And also, as we indicated earlier, it's okay for your officials to pick up a strap or an implement if the athlete drops it, because if you don't do that, then you have to unstrap the athlete. The athlete has to get out of their chair, get down there, get the strap, do another transfer onto the chair, and by that you're out of time and you're halfway through the throwing time. That's not helping the athlete, and it's not helping us to have a good competition. So we do allow that. What we don't want you to do is doing the strapping process yourself, if that makes sense to you all. Allowed assistance. Okay, these numbers are difficult to remember, and I would suggest people making a cheat sheet. We have one, and I believe it's on the USA track and field, adaptive track and field website. Phil can tell us at the end here. I think he said he put it up, the cheat sheet. But essentially it starts out, if you're an F31 through 33 or a 51 through 54, the most functionally impaired of those individuals that are competing seated, they're permitted an assistant. That's critical to remember if you're controlling the pit. You have individuals coming in and they're mixed class. So you've got a 53, a 54, a 55, and a 57 in your pit. And you've got some assistants back there. And one of the assistants has two athletes that's on their team in there. So he goes and helps the 53. And then when the 57 or 57 shows up, then he goes and helps them. It's easy to forget. So having that cheat sheet in handy so that to help you remember who's who is really, really useful. 31s to 33s and 51s through 53s can use strapping like we discussed already. They can have a glove on their hand and they can tie their hand and anchor that to the vertical bar. Why is that? Basically, the reason is these athletes who are more functionally impaired have very little grip. So they can take their fingers and spread them apart if they're more severely impaired, but their ability to grip and hang on to that pole is really, really difficult. So you can imagine if during the preparatory phase of the throw, they throw themselves back and their hand lets go and they fall backwards over the back of the chair. That would be a disaster. So we allow them to tie their hand to the chair with the use of a glove because it actually protects the hand. That's the rationale for doing that. In sports classes T12, the intellectually impaired, or the middle of the visually impaired group, the T20s, the intellectually impaired, and the T31, the low end of the CP group, the 35s through 38s, the ambulatory CP, and all the amputees, they have disabilities that sometimes make it kind of difficult to reach down and fiddle with the starting blocks and set them. So in the call room, you can get a form, there's a place for a diagram, and you diagram where you want the starting blocks set and at what angle. And that can come out and be given to the starter's assistant, and they can assist that an individual athlete to set the blocks as they desire. Again, we have the track and field intellectually impaired athletes, the TF20s, the 35s to 38s, the ambulatory CP, and the amputees. In the long and triple jump, they might require to have their runway markers set at whatever distances they desired. Again, the intellectually impaired athletes, sometimes they forget or have trouble kind of understanding what they're trying to do. They know where they know they have to take off from their mark, so we assist them. Ambulatory CP, sometimes coordination is a bit of an issue and it's difficult for them to set the marks. And if you've ever seen a double amputee, upper extremity or upper leg, try and bend over and do something on the runway, it's really, really hard. So again, those amputees, we provide assistance in setting their markers on the runway.
Jerry, just before leaving, Denise made a comment about race running, that it's going to be called frame running, but after the Paralympics in Tokyo, that's when the new name will come in.
Thanks for reminding me of that. Yes, that there's going to be a new classification system for the 31s and the 32s. They will be given a whole new classification designation, and the name will be changed to frame running, which seems more commensurate with what they're actually doing on the track. Thanks, Denise. You're keeping me straight on my task here.
And hey, Jerry, in the course and the test, we've already changed to frame running. So all the references in the course are to frame runner.
Perfect. Again, all other classes, if they're not allowed an assistant without asking for one, they can go to the call room and get a form and fill that out. And that will be presented to the TD, and they may or may not request permission. Of course, they have to see the medical personnel too. And it's important to note, we talk about guides for the visually impaired, and now we're talking about assistants. What's the difference between an assistant and a guide? These are assistants, and they're not the guides for the visually impaired that we're talking about now. They operate under an entirely different set of rules. If you folks will be around for our presentation of the visually impaired athletes in adaptive track and field, you'll see us talk a lot about what the guides can and can't do and how that's different. Again, timing for seated throws. The rule of thumb is the F31s, 51s through 53s have longer time than everybody else. That's how I tend to think about it, and that's how I remember it when I'm out there performing my task as a referee. It's those more severely impaired individuals that have a little bit more time to be able to strap themselves in and do their warm-ups and be prepared to compete. And then again, if you're in 2 or more pools, you don't have warm-up throws, so the amount of time is cut significantly, but the 2 groups are exactly the same. The 31s, the F31s, the F51s through 53s are 3 minutes, and the all others are 2 minutes. It's easier to remember that way. I think it is. But again, I recommend a cheat sheet. Now, last but not least, I guess, is we have to think about judging the event. Well, somebody already mentioned something, I believe, in the chat room. It's a lot to keep track of. You got to worry about the throwing action. You've got to be watching that vertical bar to see if they're using that to use the stored energy from leaning way back and having that bar bend, storing energy, and that actually helps them come forward during the throwing movement. There are a number of other throwing technical violations that we'll talk about. And last but not least is lifting. Some of the most contentious things that we do in terms of looking at lifting, but there is a rationale, and I'll talk about that here in just a moment. Now, we talked about we have a team that's going to tie the chair down to the platform. Not tie the athlete to the chair, but tie the chair to the platform. That is our responsibility as official to perform that task. Now, if for some reason the athlete performs their throw, and in that process, one of our straps or chains breaks, what happens? Do we just give them another throw? Or do we call the throw as it was and take that, whether it was a foul or not? What we are allowed to do is the athlete gets an option. They can take the throw wherever it landed. Who knows, it might have been his own personal best, and I'd take it too. Or we can give them another throw. And that is something that the chief judge and or referee would talk to the athlete during the process of that. We would go in and fix that. Now, if the athlete, let me see if I got the right slide here. If, however, the athlete during the performance of his or her throw, their straps break that are tying them down, the straps across their leg, the strap across their waist, whatever is tying them and securing them to the throwing chair, it breaks during that process. And the same thing happens. The throw is either a foul or it's in. It may be a great throw, it may be a really terrible throw. But in this case, the athlete does not have an option. And the reason is because the athlete's equipment, including his or her chair, is their responsibility. So those straps are not our straps. They don't belong to the local organizing committee. They don't belong to the officials. They belong to the athletes, and those straps are what they use. And if they should break, it's their responsibility to have them in good enough condition to prevent them from breaking. And that's the rationale for that. So if our chains break that tie the chair down, they get an option to take the throw or not, or get another throw. If the chains tying them to the chair break, it is the athlete's responsibility and they don't get the option. Another unique piece about this is you noticed in some of those pictures probably, and you'll see some more here soon, if an athlete touches any of those holding straps that are tying the chair to the platform outside of that vertical plane of the circle, and you saw on those platforms, it's only inscribed in the front because that's all we need. If they happen to touch a strap outside, either inadvertently or on purpose, that is a foul. And what's the analogy? You'll see in able-bodied sport, a lot of times athletes will reach out and tap the top of the toe board and tap out, saying, don't bother measuring that. Let's not waste our time. I hated that throw. It's terrible. Let's move on. This is what that is, basically. You'll see sometimes an athlete just reach out there and nail the strap in front of them, and you'll call a foul and move on to the next throw. So lifting, again, this is the most difficult part to really understand, and that's why we're going to spend some time here in the next few minutes looking at some video and talking about what's a lift, what isn't, and how you think about judging that, where you kind of think you need to be in order to judge it. As you can imagine, there are a lot of different positions you could look at an athlete and watch them when you're looking at a whole bunch of other things. So first of all, it's the position of the judge for optimum observation. And here is my biggest clue for you. If you're running a seated throws pit, or you're an official that's watching some element of that, watch the athlete when they're doing their warm-ups. That's going to clue you into exactly what's going to happen when they're throwing competitively. You can use that information to say, well, gee, you know, it looks like their left buttock is lifting up every time they throw during their warm-ups. Maybe I better go over there and watch from that angle so that I can maybe see that happen when they're throwing their competitive throws. Also, we have to look at the buttocks. We'll talk about lifting in a moment. Basically, your buttocks and the entire part of the upper part of your leg must remain seated at all times until the throw has landed inside the sector. After that point, you can move. So we have to watch and make sure that the buttocks and the legs stay in contact with the seat. We'll
Now,
talk
Jerry, if I could interrupt for just a moment.
Please do.
For this, as well as the part about the knees coming up. If you're watching the athlete during warm-up for clues and you see something that might be a problem, it's okay as an official to let the athlete know that this might happen. And if it happens during a throw, it may end up being a foul.
No, I would agree. I have often said, hey, I'm seeing you throw, and once you start throwing competitively, I'm going to have to call it a foul, and this is why. It's not that you're doing anything you wouldn't do for any of the other athletes. It's not providing any kind of unfair advantage.
Yeah, I've seen Jerry talk to Canadians differently, mind you.
Absolutely. Or maybe yes, I don't talk to them at all. So observation position, watching the buttocks during all phases of the throw for lifting and observing the knees, because the knees, and I'll show you in a minute, it's much easier to take a look at the picture. You got to be looking at the knees too. So how do you stand in the back, watch the buttocks, stand off to the side so you can watch the knees, and then don't forget you got to watch the throw. It's a lot going on. So here's a little picture out of the rule book, and I'll use this to give you an idea what is the definition of lifting. And this is a quote out of the rule book. The athlete must sit so that both legs are in contact with the seat surface from the back of the knee, which is right here. This is the seat, from the back of the knee to the back of the buttock, which is a poor term, but that's the way the rule reads. It's really the ischial tuberosity. It's this bony prominence at the bottom of the pelvis. Drawing a line here from the top of the pelvis down here. It's this part right here. Can you see my arrow, David?
Yes.
Okay. And then you have back here, fleshy buttock. If you're real skinny, you don't have much of this. If you're a bigger individual, you'll have a little bit more. It's okay if this comes up, and I'll show you some examples. But from here all the way up to the back of the leg right here, you must be in contact with the seat. And I'm going to show in the next slide what we really mean and why we're talking about this part of the leg being in touch with the seat. There'll be 2 more slides up again. Seating position. A lot of athletes will sit straight forward facing the sector and throw from that position, kind of from the side, especially if it's the discus. But these 2 athletes are doing something a bit unique. One athlete, the top athlete, he's straddling the corner here. You can see he has his legs tied to the frame, which is okay. And the back of the knee here is against the side, and the back of the knee here is against the side. And that's perfectly legitimate. You see this young man has actually straddled both sides and done the same sort of thing. And as long as during the throw, there's no space between the back of the knee and the chair, you're okay. Sliding along that surface during rotation during the throw, as long as you don't create a gap there, that's perfectly okay. So if you see somebody sitting like this, don't get all worried about it. Just keep an eye on what kind of movements those knees make. Lifting. I'm going to show you some video here. Start out with, this is an example of a valid lifting foul call. The audio doesn't make any difference. Okay, I'll play it one more time. Watch here. Okay, hopefully, this was in Indonesia, I think. There was an official from this viewpoint looking at this side. And you can see, this is a frozen frame out of that video. You can see how high he comes up. That arrow is pointing at approximately where that ischial tuberosity is. From here all the way forward is what you're looking at. And that is elevated above the seat. On the left side over here, it's not, but on the right side it is. So indeed, that's a foul. Over here, we're going to give you an example of a thrower who doesn't lift, but it might look like it is. Let's watch the video. I'm going to watch right about here. Happens really quickly, doesn't it? Let me run it one more time. Okay. So this top picture right here that I'm pointing to, that's where his seated position is. The fleshy part of the buttock right there is in contact with the seat. And this is the highest point. If you compare this part profile to this profile, this is how high this fleshy buttock comes up above the seat. But right about here is where that ischial tuberosity is. That has not lifted off the seat. So from this position here all the way forward to the back of his knees, you can see the back of the knee against the material of the chair there. He's perfectly legitimate. He stays completely seated. That would not be a lifting foul, but it sort of looks like it. I'll go back to the video here again. You can see him come up and down, up and down. He comes close, but that would be a call that I would make, is it's not a foul and it's a legitimate throw. Certainly open for discussion on that anytime. Okay, the question for this young lady throwing over here on the left, whoops, is does she lift? Watch the video. What do you think? Anybody say lift? Anybody say no? Okay. Well, let's talk about this. She did lift. Taking the frame out of this video at the highest point of her preparatory phase of the throw, you can see her left ischium is well elevated above the seat, but as her right is contact. And look how her upper torso is. She has rotated with that shot put in her hand all the way to the left, and that ischium, that buttock, comes up off the seat during that process, largely because she's done a bad job of strapping. I'm surprised a coach didn't note that before they sent her into this competition. What happens here is your spine, each segment of your spine allows you a little bit of rotation, and they move a little bit each time. But at the bottom of your spine, you're hooked to the pelvis. So once you reach that limit of rotation, your pelvis rocks. And depending whether you're rocking backwards for the preparatory phase or going forwards to the final phase of the throw, your knees will come back and forth because your pelvis is moving forward and backwards like that. That's why you have to look not only at the phase of the throw where the throw occurs, but it's also at any point in time during the preparatory phase of the throw, they lift their buttocks or their knees come forward. I'll show you that in a minute. That is a foul. And why is that? Because it gives them a little advantage. If they can do this, it allows them to do a more complete follow through. And if you're a coach, you know that follow through is really critical to having optimal performance. And it's our job as judges and referees to keep a close eye on this.
And that is because we want to ensure that the competition is fair for everybody.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, question is, in this particular picture, we're going to run the video, and the question again is, does this athlete lift? This was in London, wasn't it? 17, 16, David?
Yes, 17.
17. Okay, run it again. Is that a lift? Okay, we got the diagram up here. You're looking at here. He's seated down. Here's this fleshy part of the buttock right here. Sorry, I have my dog barking in the background. My apologies. And this still picture here is at the maximum height of his buttock during his throw. And you can see the difference here. And I can run it with this video. It's a little more informative, I think. Let me find the right place. Okay. Sorry about that. You can see that's as high as it gets. He comes close. The fleshy part of his buttock is elevated. But really what's happening here, another explanation of this, Denise, correct me if I'm wrong, is basically you have some pelvic tilt. So this vertical line here, the top of the pelvis and the ischium are kind of on top of each other. Remember when your mother used to tell you, don't slouch when you're sitting at the dinner table and you kind of got this rounded spine and you're kind of slumped down? It's a nice stable position. What happens is this top of this pelvis tilts backwards this way, kind of pushes this forward, and you're sitting on a lot of this fleshy buttock. So what happens when you do your throw, and he's nicely strapped in to hold this part of his pelvis in place. All he is doing is he's sitting up straight. That's the only thing he's doing. He's not lifting, he's not elevating this ischium here above the chair. It's hard to do. It's a judgment call, but I wanted to make sure that those of you here watching this, kind of understand what's going on here and get an assessment of what a real foul looks like and what may sort of look like it at the moment, because when you're looking at it in real time, it happens in a second or less. It's difficult to call sometimes, but this individual did not lift. I hope that was useful. Now the knees. We keep talking about the knees. Here is the original diagram. Whoops. Sorry, I've got a bad mouse here. I'm driving it. Okay, so the rule says that from this part here, the ischial tuberosity all the way to the front of the seat, the back of the knee, here's the knee bone, here's the knee up here. This part of the leg, back of the knee, must be in contact with the front of the seat. Okay, movement of the knees away from the front of the seat is lifting. And I go on, I can hear some of you, and I say it too, what? How is that lifting? That's because the definition says that you have to be completely seated. Seated in this term means that all of your leg from that bony part of the pelvis forward has to be on the seat. And if your leg moves forward away from the seat, then you look right here, part of your leg right there behind your knee is not sitting on the seat. And that's the rationale for the rule. We could have a long discussion about what I think of the rule, but that's for another day. But this is the process. You have to look. You have to look.
I was just going to say, usually Jerry and I have that discussion on a regular basis.
Usually over something cold too. Yeah. So again, this is what lifting is all about. You have to be looking at the knees, and it doesn't have to be both knees. One or the other can move forward away from the seat. And as you saw in that one picture of that young woman who was throwing, it doesn't have to be both ischial tuberosities. It doesn't have to be both buttocks. One or the other can happen. And I will say at this point too, when you're watching them warm up, that's when you're going to catch this. And that's where you're going to find out, where should I be when in order to catch any kind of issues, because it looks like during their warm-ups, they may have a propensity to either move their knees away or roll way up high on that buttock and lift the other side. And that can be that will take place during the preparatory phase of the throw, as well as the final phase of the throw. going forward. Okay, you remember this? This was the very first slide we showed, and this athlete threw, and we're going. The question is, did they do anything wrong? And we suggested maybe they did, and there might be one or two things going on. So I'm going to show you the video again. One more time. As always, it takes place in a hurry. Now you see the answer now. So we're looking particularly at the knees. You can see this knee is way out in front of this knee, okay? That should not happen, because if this knee is way out there, it's well away from the front of the seat, which is right there. And I can show you a little bit better by moving through the video. So as he has the shot put, getting his mindset. He's in the preparatory the phase of the throw. He turns to the right a little bit and goes way back. You see his knee pop out. Okay, watch right there. So as he reared back, as he goes back, you can see that knee actually lifts up and moves forward. And then, whoops, as he goes forward, that left knee comes back in contact with the seat and the right knee comes forward. And the reason is he did a poor job of strapping. He doesn't have any kind of strapping that would prevent the pelvis from shoving his knees forward, either during the preparatory phase or the final phase of the throw. And you can imagine what a straightforward thing would be to do is perhaps run some straps in front of the knee around here to prevent both knees from coming forward. And coaches, that is what I recommend you do. You need straps not only on top of the legs, but running backwards at the pelvis to stabilize the pelvis on the platform, on top of the knees, and you need that strap in front of the knees to prevent that from going forward. That's a great stable position to be throwing from. And we see this a lot. So it's something you have to be aware of, and you'll see it quite frequently. So that should suggest that you or a member of your team be in a position to watch the knees, say, well, you're standing from behind or an angle from behind, looking to see what's going on. Amputees, not too different. You can see in this particular photo here, left leg amputee. The amputee is below the knee. Here's his interconnection into his prosthesis. And he's got a nice strap there holding it in. And what he's doing is he's holding the back of the knee against the seat. You can see that he's straddling the seat. I really like this position. It is very stable. Holding on to the bar, he's holding on the top of the bar. He's in good position. He's got a strap coming up across his legs. Not having really watched him throw, he may or may not need something across his pelvis to keep his rear end back, because if he rears back and rolls over on one cheek, he may be lifting, but we're not looking from behind. Remember again, the amputees, in addition to the F35 cerebral palsy athletes, they're all standing athletes. They have the option, because they have a poor ability to stabilize themselves. This athlete wearing his prosthetic limb might not be the most stable person in the world, and certainly might have a lot of difficulty running down the javelin runway to make a throw. So from a classification standpoint, we allow that athlete to choose to throw as an F57, and that is any of the amputees. And if I'm saying something not quite right, Denise is an international classifier, so I rely on her for everything. And the same thing for the CP athlete. They would become an F34. the most seated wheelchair. Basically, the lower functioning CP athletes and lower limb amputees can choose to throw, and they move from their ambulatory class to the highest functioning class. So that's important to keep that in mind, especially when you're looking at the flight sheets out there on the field. You go, why is this ambulatory athlete in their chair? It's okay. Club is a unique implement that we have for the more severely functionally limited athletes that are in our competitions. It's a unique club. You can see it in this picture right here, having been flung up into the air. You saw in one of the first couple of slides that we presented, there is a weight that's required, 397 grams. There are some physical dimensions that are required that are checked in weights and measures. Make sure all the clubs are of a standard size and dimension. There's some flexibility, but that's a pretty standard looking club. Club can be thrown any way you want. It's kind of like the discus. The club can be thrown facing forward. The club can be thrown facing sideways. And the club can be thrown backwards. And that's what you see this athlete doing. This picture is taken from inside the sector, pointing straight at the athlete. That's the back of their chair. You can see their bib number here. You can see the athlete stretched way back, just having released that club. It's a very powerful way for these athletes to use the musculature and the coordination that they have to throw, because it's difficult to use a more common method of throwing a particular implement. But one point we have to remind ourselves is there's still a lifting room rule. Just because there's something doing something unique and they're using a different implement, it doesn't mean that they're allowed to lift. That is not allowed. So here are a couple of movies. These are valid throws. Okay, I've looked at this video a number of times. This is one of those cases where he rolls over on his right buttock and that left buttock kind of comes up, and it's difficult because everything is black here to really see, but it looks like it's just the fleshy part of his buttock coming up during his throw. He's a left-handed guy. He rotates and throws out into the sector. He's kind of faced side. Actually, he's straddling the corner here. He puts himself in a really nice stable position. My advice to him would be maybe put a strap on his pelvis to make sure this doesn't become a problem for him and he winds up getting a foul call for lifting. Over here is another young lady. Happens really quick. Watch it again. I like this picture a lot. Look at the strapping. You can see these nice wide straps. You can see a pelvic belt that doesn't just come straight up and down, but comes backwards here. It's holding her pelvis in nice squarely onto the seat. What she doesn't have is anything in front of her knees, but when you watch her throw, she's not moving around. So for her, it's probably just fine. You know, from thinking from a coaching perspective, would I add those? I don't know. It doesn't seem like it's an issue. One other point I want to make here is you see that the chair is, the back of the chair is leaning backwards. That's perfectly okay. It's not like the vertical pole that has to be straight up. This can lean back. Now let's see if I can get this. So you can see she leans forward, comes back. Those straps keep her nice and in contact with the seat. So that's what you want to look for a really valid throw. Two different positions. Okay, one more. Now, remember we're talking about lifting rules. Lifting rules apply to club throwers, whether throwing forward, backwards, or sideways. Let's watch this video. As you can see, her functional limitation is fairly significant. It has some limited ability to control her movements, but she finally kind of gets things lined up. She's been practicing. She's a good athlete. She makes the throw. Let's watch it again. Okay. So the question is that a foul? What do you think? Did she foul? Looks like a pretty good throw. Knees didn't come away from the front of the seat, so it wasn't the knees. She didn't hit any straps. However, when she went into full extension, arching her back over the back of the chair, trying to get maximum follow through, you can see what happens to her buttocks. Her leg and her buttocks come lifting way up off the seat. And she doesn't really have a very good pelvic strap. It's coming back here. It's not doing the job of keep holding that back onto the seat. If she did so, she wouldn't have to worry about that. It would hold her there, and she could still use maximum effort in throwing her arm and her trunk backwards to maximize her throw. So you coaches that might be watching this that do seated throws, these are the kind of things that I look for, that I see that if these changes could be made would probably make things a lot better for the athlete and help to give them maximum performances. The last element we want to talk to tonight about is there is one class of athletes and one implement that IPC and WPA has changed the rules for. It's basically because we've identified limitations in functional movements for this particular class of athletes. The F32, field 32 shot put throwers, male and female. It was decided to modify these rules. Basically, the anecdote, basically it was because in Rio, when we had the women come in to do the F32 shot put, there were only 6 women in the event. This is the Paralympics, and you've only got 6 women worldwide to do this event. That was concerning. And what happened was that we only, I may be misremembered, but I think we only had 4 or 5 legal throws during the entire competition for them. And why was that? Well, you know, the shot put has some very standardized stereotypical rules that you have to follow in order to be able to do a legal put, if you will. What happens is because of their inability to, remember, this is a lower functioning, they have a more severe physical functional limitation that prevents them from coordinating some of their movements. So it's very, very difficult for them in some instances to maybe hold a shot put up near their cheek. It's very difficult in some instances for them to extend forward in a straight and linear manner and do a put. Some of that lack of control is once you begin to push forward, that control problem becomes an issue, and it may force you to drop that elbow and get into a strange position that you otherwise might not want to do. So for sport class F32, we now allow lateral movement away from the shot, away from the chin or neck during putting. There is no requirement for a straight and continuous movement of the shot put at all. However, we'll show a movie in a second. However, you still cannot take the shot put behind the plane of the shoulder. That is still called a foul. That's a stereotypical baseball pitch. So I'll show you some examples of this. F32 male. Happens really fast. You definitely have your eyes open. Hopefully you have other officials that have their eyes open. Yes, it is foul. Taken at this point during this video over here, you can see where his hand is. It's way, way behind the shoulder. So according to Rule 31.1 that says you can't take it behind the shoulder, that is a foul. And you can see he goes back, preparatory phase, the vertical bar is fine, his knees are fine, his buttocks are fine. He gets back there, it's against his chin, and tries to go forward, and he's having trouble maintaining that shot once it comes away from his chin. The fact that it went away from his chin with these new rules is fine, but he went behind the shoulder, so this is a foul. Here's a very nice woman from Australia competing at the World Championships in London. Let's see here. Let's see what happens here. Is this a foul? Let's show that one more time. We video referees have it so easy, we can do replay. It's not like when you're standing there and you have to make these snap decisions. But that's why we're here. That's why we're there. The video referees are there to support you as an official out there on the field. And here we go. So is it a foul? I'll say if the shot put, this is as far back as she comes during the preparatory phase of her throw. The shot put is away from her chin and shoulder, but it's not behind the plane of the shoulder. So from that standpoint, it's perfectly fine. Go over here and see if we can watch this. Here she comes back. Shot put goes out like that. She's still right there on top of her shoulder, comes forward. Fairly straight and continuous motion, actually, for her. She's one of the more functional in this group. So anything else wrong? Remember, we have to, everybody's still required to follow the lifting rule. So what about, here she goes forward. Here we go. Right about there. I think they called this, I don't remember. But as you can see, when she did her follow through and it was a good throw, what she did is she kept on rotating. And that caused that. The knees, she's straddling the seat. You see how many of these people are straddling the seat like that? It's a nice stable position. She's well strapped down. Her leg moves a little bit, but it's just moving against the seat. They're not popping forward like that, but it's her buttock that comes up, and you can see what a hard call that is. Yeah, you can see her shoulder comes around. Had she not done that, she'd have been okay, but right about there, it's a close call. And then you're trying to call that real time, it's hard to do. That's why it's really helpful. You probably would have noted that had you been watching her do warm-ups and had a good feel for maybe I should be standing over on this side, this corner to watch this, because I saw that she's moving a lot during her throw, especially in the final phase of the throw. One more. What do you think? Was that a foul? Yeah, it was a little harder to call. but look over at this still. There's the plane of her shoulder and there's her hand back behind her. Kind of looking like it's in baseball pitch mode. However, let me get this, if you watch, she goes back and starts to come forward, making the throw, and look at her buttocks. Continue to come up. It's hard to see in this video, but what happens is her follow through causes her right shoulder to come around, just like the other athlete. And briefly, it looks like she probably lifted, but there's no contrast on those black jeans in this video. So that's really difficult. But if you were standing there, you'd be able to see that pretty readily. And you probably would have noted it again if you had been watching her during the preparatory phase or throw. But the point of this was behind the shoulder. Next to her chin, comes away from the chin, falls behind her shoulder, and not so much of a foot. For this particular class of individuals, you can see it's a little tricky to watch all these elements of their throw and still understanding that their disability is such that they have a little bit of controlling movement. And that's why things don't go as you would imagine an individual that doesn't have that particular disability. So that's all I have about lifting and assistance and seated throws. David, do you have anything, or are there any questions? For sure. Nope.
Well, I want to thank both of you for presenting tonight. I hope everybody had a good time and learned a few things and got a little bit more out of the videos than these when you're watching them in the course, if you've taken the course. So you're better prepared to officiate this coming year. Stay tuned next month on April 6th, we will publish a invitation for you to join us to look at the visually impaired and all the aspects of how to officiate them on the track and in the field.
And for
Well,
sure,
thank you for everything.
Oh, you're quite welcome. I'd like to invite you, you can see my email and David's email there. If there are questions, things you didn't understand, didn't catch something that either one of us said, please don't hesitate to drop us a line. We'll try and get back to you as soon as we can. We want to see you have an easier time doing some of these more difficult things like seated throws.
There was one question about whether the slides were going to be available and where, and I think Phil is putting them together right now.
Right. We're gonna make the video available so you can watch the whole hour and a half to hour and 3/4, and we will also make this slide presentation available, and both of them will be available on Adaptive Track and Field USA's website, atfusa.org, as well as all of the tips for track and field that are up there now.
And that's going to be a PDF with links to the videos, right?
That is true.
Okay, great. Thanks, Phil.
You're welcome.